What does a man look like after being emotionally broken by a narcissistic woman? Not the version people expect, not loud, not violent, not collapsed on the floor. More often he looks functional. He goes to work, he answers texts, he shows up on time, he even smiles when spoken to. From the outside, nothing appears wrong. But inside, something fundamental has shifted. His certainty is gone. His confidence doesn't feel earned anymore. It feels conditional. He apologizes quickly, sometimes without knowing why. He hesitates before speaking, scanning the room, reading the mood, measuring the cost of honesty. This is the man no one asks about. We have language for the grieving woman, the survivor, the one who escaped. But when a man is slowly worn down by the person he loved, the script disappears. He's told to be strong, to be rational, to handle it. And so he does, by going quiet. A broken man isn't someone who was hit once. He's someone who was doubted daily. Someone whose reality was questioned until he learned to question himself. Someone who stayed calm, not because he felt safe, but because reacting only made things worse. If any part of this feels familiar, there's nothing wrong with you. You didn't lose your strength, you were adapting to survive. And before we can talk about healing, we have to be honest about what breaking actually looks like, when it happens quietly, over time, to someone who was never allowed to fall apart. Most men don't walk into these relationships thinking they're about to lose themselves. They walk in thinking they've finally been seen. In the beginning, the connection feels unusually precise. She doesn't just like you, she gets you. Your humor, your values, your frustrations, even the parts of you that rarely surface. Conversations flow effortlessly. Preferences align almost too neatly. It feels less like dating and more like recognition. This is where the trap begins. What looks like deep compatibility is often something more calculated, mirroring. She studies you closely, what excites you, what wounds you, what makes you feel admired or inadequate. Then she reflects those traits back at you, not consciously in a scheming way, but instinctively. Because her sense of self is fragile, she needs to anchor it to someone else. This isn't intimacy, it's calibration. She isn't bonding with you as a separate human being. She's learning how to feel whole by aligning herself with your identity. The warmth you feel isn't coming from mutual discovery, it's coming from how closely she matches you. And because the match feels so rare, your nervous system relaxes. You trust it. For many men, this triggers something even deeper. Being reflected this perfectly doesn't just feel romantic, it feels purposeful. You feel useful, needed, chosen not for what you provide, but for who you are. That's why the bond forms so quickly. It bypasses caution and speaks directly to worth. But here's the quiet truth most men don't realize until much later. She wasn't falling in love with you. She was falling in love with how she felt when she saw herself through your admiration. You became the mirror that stabilized her. And the moment you stopped reflecting her ideal image, when you have a need, a boundary, or a bad day, the intimacy didn't deepen, it fractured. Because what was never built on two solid selves can't survive reality. There is a vulnerability in men that rarely gets named, and because it stays unnamed, it's easy to exploit. Most men are not taught to measure their worth by how they feel. They're taught to measure it by what they provide, what they protect, and how useful they are to the people they love. Purpose is not an abstract concept for men, it's embodied. It lives in responsibility, in showing up, in being relied on. So when a woman enters a man's life and looks at him with admiration, relief, or dependence, something deep is activated. It doesn't feel like ego, it feels like alignment, like stepping into a role that finally makes sense. This is where the bond tightens. When she frames herself as vulnerable, overwhelmed, misunderstood, emotionally fragile, the man doesn't just feel attraction, he feels needed. And being needed doesn't register as pressure, it registers as worth. His nervous system reads it as meaning, I matter here. I make things safer. I make things better. This isn't weakness, it's how many men are wired to love. But that same wiring becomes a fault line in the presence of a narcissistic dynamic, because once his worth is tied to stabilizing her emotions, the rules change. If she's unhappy, he feels responsible. If she withdraws, he assumes he failed. If she's in pain, he searches himself for the cause. Over time, protection turns into self-erasure, purpose turns into anxiety, and worth becomes conditional, granted only when he's useful, agreeable, or silent. This is why leaving feels so disorienting. He's not just losing a relationship, he's losing the role that made him feel like a man. And until that truth is understood, healing can't begin. The shift rarely announces itself. There is no clear moment where love turns into harm. That's what makes it so effective. At first, it's small. A comment said half-jokingly, a sigh that lingers a little too long, a comparison slipped into conversation, someone else's ambition, someone else's success, someone else's attentiveness. Nothing overt enough to confront, nothing solid enough to point to, just enough to register. This is the frog effect. If the water boiled instantly, you would jump out. But when the temperature rises slowly, your nervous system adapts. You normalize what would have once felt unacceptable. Each moment of discomfort is just slightly worse than the last. And because you handled the previous one, you handle this one too. What most men don't realize is that devaluation isn't about criticism, it's about conditioning. Every subtle put-down retrains you to monitor yourself, to anticipate her moods, to preempt her disappointment. You start editing your words before you speak. You work harder, give more, try to become easier to be with. Not because you're weak, but because you remember how it felt in the beginning, and you believe that version of her is still reachable. This is where provider anxiety quietly takes hold. Her dissatisfaction doesn't feel like her issue. It feels like your failure. If she's unhappy, you must not be doing enough. If she's distant, you must be losing value. But here's the truth most men never hear. She isn't devaluing you because you're failing. She's devaluing you because your stability threatens her fragile sense of control. Your independence reminds her of what she lacks. Your boundaries signal separation, and separation feels like danger. So she lowers you, slowly, carefully, until you're small enough to manage. And by the time you notice how far you've drifted from yourself, leaving no longer feels simple. It feels like stepping into unknown water without knowing who you are anymore. At some point, you may have asked yourself the question everyone asks from the outside. Why didn't I just leave? And maybe you answered it the same way many men do, with shame. But staying wasn't a character flaw, it was a biological trap. The dynamic you were in operates on a principle called intermittent reinforcement. It's the same mechanism that keeps people glued to slot machines. If every pull resulted in a loss, you'd walk away. But when the reward comes occasionally, unexpectedly, unpredictably, it becomes irresistible. Your brain stays engaged, waiting for the next win. In a narcissistic relationship, the wins are emotional. Most of the time she's distant, critical, or cold. Then, without warning, she softens. A night of intimacy, a moment of warmth, a version of her that feels like the beginning again. Just enough to remind you why you fell in love. When that happens, your brain releases dopamine, the chemical of anticipation and pursuit. Oxytocin follows, reinforcing attachment. Relief floods your system. There she is, you think. We're okay. I knew it. But what you're responding to isn't love. It's contrast. Healthy love is consistent. It doesn't spike and crash. It doesn't require you to endure pain to earn closeness. What you were experiencing was a trauma bond, a chemical attachment formed under conditions of emotional instability. Over time, your nervous system learns a dangerous equation. Safety comes after distress. Closeness is earned through endurance. Calm only arrives once you've proven yourself again. This is why peace begins to feel boring and chaos feels familiar. Your system has been rewired. Leaving a trauma bond doesn't feel like walking away from a bad situation. It feels like withdrawal. Your body misses the highs, even while your mind knows the cost. You crave contact. You replay memories. You look for signs that it could still work. This is why telling someone in this position to just move on is useless. You're not breaking a habit, you're undoing a neurological pattern. And until that is understood, men will keep blaming themselves for reactions that were trained into their bodies, not chosen by their character. One of the most disorienting parts of this dynamic is how gender itself gets turned into a weapon, quietly, socially, and often without witnesses. When conflict arises, she doesn't need to overpower you, she needs to collapse. Tears appear, her voice shakes, her body folds inward. Suddenly, the conversation isn't about what hurt you, it's about how you made her feel unsafe, pressured, or overwhelmed. And because you're a man, the power imbalance flips instantly. Your pain becomes suspicious, your firmness becomes aggression. This is the damsel strategy, not weakness, but control. By presenting herself as fragile, she forces you into the role of protector, even when you're the one who's been harmed. You start softening your words, backing down, apologizing, not because you were wrong, but because the risk of being seen as the bad guy feels unbearable. Sex often becomes part of this system. Intimacy isn't shared freely, it's rationed. When you comply, when you please, when you stay agreeable, it returns. When you push back or express needs of your own, it disappears. Over time, desire becomes conditional approval. Rejection doesn't just hurt, it destabilizes your sense of worth. And then there's the audience. She may speak quietly to friends or family about how hard things are for her, how distant you've become, how angry or cold you seem. By the time you realize what's happening, the story has already been written, and you're not the protagonist, you're the problem. This is where many men feel truly trapped, because defending yourself risks confirming the narrative. Staying silent feels safer, even as it isolates you further. The cruel irony is this: the men most vulnerable to this dynamic are often the least threatening ones, empathic, controlled, conscientious. And in a system that equates masculinity with danger, their silence becomes the very thing that's used against them. By the time gaslighting takes hold, the damage is no longer just emotional, it's epistemic. It affects how you know what you know. At first it sounds harmless, a disagreement about what was said, a different memory of how something happened. I never said that. You're taking it the wrong way. Small corrections that make you pause and reconsider. You assume good faith. You assume miscommunication. So you doubt yourself. Then the pattern hardens. When you raise a concern, it's denied. When you persist, you're attacked. And finally, the roles reverse. This is Darvo. Deny, attack, reverse, victim, and offender. The moment you try to name a hurt, the conversation shifts to your tone, your timing, your insecurity. Suddenly, you're defending yourself for having noticed a problem at all. What makes this so destabilizing is that it doesn't just distort facts, it trains you to distrust your internal signals. Your memory feels unreliable. Your emotions feel suspect. You start outsourcing your sense of reality to her reactions. If she's calm, things must be fine. If she's upset, you must have done something wrong. Over time, self-trust erodes. You hesitate before making decisions. You replay conversations in your head, searching for the mistake you might have made. You apologize reflexively, even when you don't understand what you're apologizing for. The ground beneath you no longer feels solid. This is why leaving doesn't immediately restore clarity. The relationship taught you to question your perception. Healing begins when you stop asking, "Was it really that bad?" and start asking, "Why was I trained to doubt myself in the first place?" When people talk about abuse, they rarely count the cost that doesn't leave visible marks. For many men, that cost is financial, but the real damage goes far beyond money. In these relationships, spending isn't framed as choice, it's framed as proof. Proof that you care, proof that you're capable, proof that you're a real man. Expectations escalate quietly. Better trips, nicer places, a lifestyle that stretches just past what's sustainable. And when you hesitate, the message is subtle but sharp. If you loved me, you'd figure it out. Over time, finances stop being a shared responsibility and become a test you're always failing. You work more, you save less, you justify decisions you once would have questioned. Debt accumulates, not just on paper, but in your nervous system. You're constantly bracing for the next demand. What makes this especially destructive is how closely money gets tied to identity. Providing isn't just practical, it's personal. When your ability to give becomes the measure of your worth, every limit feels like inadequacy. Saying no doesn't feel responsible, it feels like rejection. And when your resources finally run thin, something else collapses with them. The role you've been living in, the provider, the stabilizer, the one who makes things work, no longer holds. You're left not just financially depleted, but disoriented. Because you weren't valued for who you were valued for what you could sustain. Reclaiming yourself begins when you separate generosity from self-erasure, and worth from what you can afford to give. Leaving doesn't bring immediate relief. For many men, it brings silence, and that silence can feel more unsettling than the chaos that came before. Once the relationship ends, your nervous system doesn't reset, it stays alert. You flinch when your phone buzzes. You feel a surge of anxiety when someone sounds disappointed, even slightly. Hypervigilance lingers, because for a long time, being relaxed wasn't safe. You learned to scan for shifts, to prepare for emotional impact before it arrived. There's also a strange emptiness that's hard to explain. Without the constant pressure to manage someone else's moods, you're left alone with yourself, and you're not sure who that is anymore. Decisions feel heavy. You second-guess your instincts. Even simple choices can trigger doubt, because for so long, your judgment was treated as flawed. Many men describe a chronic, low-grade guilt that doesn't seem tied to anything specific. A feeling that they failed, that they should have done more. This isn't remorse, it's conditioning. When you've spent years being held responsible for someone else's emotional state, your body doesn't know how to stop carrying that burden. Social withdrawal is common too. Friends drifted away, hobbies disappeared. Your energy went into survival, not expansion. Re-entering the world can feel awkward, even exposing. This is why the aftermath often meets the criteria for complex PTSD. Not because one event was overwhelming, but because the pressure never stopped. Healing here isn't about moving on. It's about slowly teaching your system that it's finally allowed to rest, and that you're not broken for needing time to feel like yourself again. Healing doesn't begin with understanding her. It begins with detaching from the version of yourself that had to survive her. Many men believe they need closure, one last conversation, one final explanation that proves they weren't crazy. But with a narcissistic dynamic, closure keeps the bond alive. Detachment is what allows your nervous system to settle. Methods like grey rock and no contact aren't about punishment, they're about repair. You stop engaging not because you're cruel, but because your mind and body need consistency again. Reclaiming reality means relearning self-trust, making decisions without bracing for backlash, allowing calm without waiting for the next emotional shift. Slowly, a different kind of masculinity takes shape, one rooted in boundaries, discernment, and self-respect rather than endurance. You weren't broken because you cared. You were hurt because your care was exploited. If this video helped something finally make sense, consider subscribing to the channel so we can keep these conversations going. And if any part of this story felt familiar, leave a comment below. Your experience might be the clarity another man needs to realize he isn't alone.